Have you ever heard someone say Jesus prophesied falsely? Well, I'm going to break that down in today's video so you don't make the mistake of thinking that Jesus made a false prophecy. I did a video recently about whether or not Jesus lied, and it was based on a passage in Mark chapter 13. And in that video, someone commented on the video and said, well, that particular verse is one in question today, where some people say, well, Jesus made a false prophecy. We're going to start by reading the verse, and then I'm going to just show you step by step why this is not a false prophecy from Jesus and help you understand this very clearly. It's Mark chapter 13, verse 30. Jesus has been speaking for quite a bit of time, more on that in a moment, but he says in verse 30, verily I say unto you, so truly I say unto you, this is a true statement, that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. Now, the question is, well, Jesus, as I already said a lot of things so far, and is going to continue to say a lot of things. If all of these things are not passed in this generation, the generation of the people that are living, then that would mean that Jesus made a false prophecy. That is the question that arises. That is the comment which was on the video I made. A lot of people that come from this perspective, Jesus made a false prophecy, or did Jesus make an error here, focus on this word here, this generation, right? And that's fine to a certain degree, but we also have to think about what else Jesus says in the verse. Right? So he says, until all these things be done. I'm not only focusing on generations, but also focusing on till all these things be done will help you get to the truth. Because the obvious question you have to think is, well, what are these things that Jesus is speaking about? That's why I want us to go back to higher up in the chapter, because it will help us. As you can see here at the beginning of this chapter, it says he went out of the temple and they were showing him the building, the temple building. And notice Jesus says in verse 2, you see these great buildings? These buildings are going to be thrown down. They are going to be destroyed, right? This is the Genesis. And then it continues in verse 3 and says, he's sitting down on the Mountain of Olives, and Peter and James, John and Andrew, they ask him privately, right? They ask him a question privately. So this is the backdrop of what is actually happening here. This is the context, basically. They're leaving the temple. He's going to the Mountain of Olives and he's saying, look, that temple is going to be destroyed. It's going to be leveled. It's going to be razed to the ground, as they say. And then his disciples here ask him and say, look, when are these things going to be done? The 4 disciples say, tell us, when shall these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? Now, the reason I wanted to come back to his passage before we go to verse 30 again is because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all document this particular account. And it's interesting when you look at the 3 accounts, it gives us additional context to help us understand what's actually going on here. Mark, as we've seen already, has only focused on the temple, right? The temple being destroyed. When you read Matthew's account, who typically, as he was a tax collector, he had the skill of writing shorthand. This is why Matthew's gospel has a lot of what Jesus says, he's saying, because he's the one that would obviously be writing down, he's used to writing a lot of stuff. When Matthew documents this, it's the same scenario, same setting. Jesus is saying this is going to be destroyed. And the disciples ask him, not 1 question, 3 questions. When are those things going to be? What is the sign of your return? And what is the sign of the end of the world? 3 questions. And that helps us understand why Jesus now goes on to all of these different things in the conversation. He's answering 3 different questions as he's speaking through these passages. It's clear and obvious when you look at the different passages. You know what? In fact, let me even just show these to you so it's not just me talking. So Matthew chapter 24 is the other place where this is mentioned, and Luke chapter 21 as well. So in Matthew chapter 24, for example, as you can see, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and the disciples came to him and showed him the temple. And Jesus said to them in verse 2, all these things? Truly I say unto you, there's not going to be left 1 stone upon another. It's all going to be thrown down. Right? And he's sitting on the Mountain of Olives in verse 3. The disciples come unto him privately. Mark gave us the names of some of them, right? Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Tell us, when shall these things be? What is going to be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world, right? Unless all of these 3 things are happening at the same time, Jesus is going to now speak about 3 individual events. So hopefully you're seeing now, with this additional information, you can start to see why some people will get confused if they don't read this as closely as they should. Because if you think that Jesus is just speaking about one thing, then it can cause confusion, and you can think, well, Jesus said this is going to be fulfilled in this generation, but these things weren't fulfilled, only this thing was fulfilled, etc. And we can go to Luke chapter 21, right, as well, just so you can see this as well. You can see all three references. Verse 5, and he spake, and some of them spoke of the temple, how it was adorned and with goodly stones and gifts. He said, so they're telling the temple, oh, look, Jesus, the temple looks so good. And he said, as for these things which you behold, the days will come in which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall be thrown down. And they asked him in verse 7, when shall these things be? And what sign when these things shall come to pass? So you can see just by looking at all three accounts that are mentioning this, they're all giving us additional insights in their own way, right? Not contradictory, complementary, right? And especially Matthew, right? The guy who's writing down a lot of what Jesus says, right? In long form. He's the one which is significant, which helps us really unlock all of the other gospel accounts which are talking about this, because there's three questions in there. So the things which he's saying in there are going to be covering more than one topic. But one thing I want you to focus on, I mentioned it already, I'm going to say it again now before we continue. All three accounts, the genesis, the foundation of the conversation is all about the temple. That is the main thing in question, in context, that they were interested in knowing. So now let's read verse 30 again, and then I'm going to give you another reason why, which will help you understand all of this stuff as well. So it says, verily I say unto you, that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. You see, there's no problem if Jesus is specifically speaking about this generation of people, because they're all speaking and focusing on the temple. Even though Jesus is speaking about more than the temple and other stuff, he's talking about his return, he's talking about the end of the world, etc. They're all focused on the temple being destroyed. And that's what we need to focus on contextually when we see what Jesus is saying. Let me give you another reason why we know this is the better way to understand what's actually going on here. Because if you keep reading, right, let's go to verse 34. Jesus continues talking. He says, look, heaven and earth will pass away. No one's going to know that when his return is coming. Take heed, watch and pray, for you know not when the time is. But notice what it says in verse 34. For the Son of Man is as a man taking a far journey, who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to every man his work, and commanded the porter, right, the guard, to watch. Watch therefore, because you don't know when the master of the house is going to come, if he's going to come at midnight or at the cock crowing or in the morning. The point is, Jesus is saying, be prepared. What I'm telling you about is like taking a far journey. He's now speaking about his return. In Mark's gospel, he only focused on and only mentioned them saying, well, when is this going to happen? i.e. the destruction of the temple. But in Matthew's gospel account, we saw that they asked, when's this going to happen, i.e. the destruction of the temple? When are you returning? And when's the end of the world? Him now talking about him going into it being like a far country is more so speaking about his return, right? Which is the second of the three questions. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because if Jesus was saying, well, look, all of this stuff's going to happen within this generation, like right now, why would he then say a couple verses later, it's like me going on a far journey? So Jesus clearly is like showing separation between the temple, but also other stuff which is going to come after. All three gospels were focused on the destruction of the temple, but Matthew made it clear for us that there's more than one question that Jesus was answering when he was speaking through this long passage of text in Mark chapter 13, Matthew chapter 24, and Luke chapter 21. But the point is, the things which are going to be fulfilled specifically were the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 AD, about 40 years later. And within that time frame, there were still people living from that generation of people who were hearing this message, or the people that were being shared the message through the disciples, etc. And I want to say this as well. In Christendom, not everyone takes this particular interpretation of this passage, but that's not my point to say this is the right interpretation or that's the right interpretation. The sole point of today's video was to show you that Jesus saying this generation shall not pass till this stuff is fulfilled there's no problem with it. And there's no problem because when we look at the context of what happens in Mark, but also we look at the context of all three gospels talking about this, it's obvious that Jesus is speaking about different things. And the thing he's speaking about with that generation is the temple being destroyed. The other stuff, as he continues to say, is like him going on to a far journey and returning. But he continues to say to them, be prepared, be vigilant, right? Wait and be sober. Don't let this stuff catch you unawares. Don't be unprepared, basically. So hopefully this helps you understand this passage. If you have any other questions about the Bible you want me to talk about, leave them in the comment section below and I'll make videos about them at some point in the future. God bless.